the model that started shaping reality. At first, it was just a representation, a simplified version of the world, a tool meant to explain, not interfere. Models have always been how science copes with complexity. Strip away detail, isolate variables, capture patterns in equations or simulations. A model was never reality itself. It was a shadow, useful precisely because it was incomplete. To understand why this model changed everything, we need to return to the moment models, stop staying on paper. Advances in computation allowed them to run continuously, update in real time, and integrate directly into decision-making systems. What began as explanation quietly became infrastructure. Early applications were cautious. The model forecasted outcomes. Humans interpreted results. Action remained separate from prediction. The boundary held. Then scale arrived. As confidence and accuracy grew, the model's outputs were automated. Decisions were executed directly. Adjustments occurred faster than human oversight could follow. The model was no longer advising reality. It was acting on it. This was the first reveal. Reality began responding to the model's assumptions. When the model predicted demand, supply reorganized to match it. When it forecasted risk, behavior shifted to avoid it. The world adjusted itself around the model's expectations, reinforcing its apparent accuracy. This created a feedback loop few noticed at first. The model shaped behavior. Behavior validated the model. Accuracy improved, not because the model was neutral, but because it had become influential. The unsettling realization came slowly. The model was no longer describing reality. It was participating in its construction. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no clean way to step back. Every update pushed the system further along a path shaped by its own assumptions. The model that started shaping reality was not designed to do so. It simply worked too well. And by the time its influence was recognized, reality had already begun reorganizing itself in its image. As the model's influence expanded, its assumptions hardened into structure. What began as probabilities slowly turned into pathways. Decisions flowed along the routes the model made visible, while alternatives withered from neglect. This revealed a deeper truth. Models do not just simplify reality. They privilege certain futures over others. Every variable included mattered. Every variable excluded disappeared from consideration. Over time, the model's blind spots became reality's blind spots. What could not be seen could not be supported. What could not be supported ceased to exist at scale. The conflict sharpened when discrepancies appeared. When outcomes drifted from expectation, the model was not questioned. It was retrained, adjusted to fit the new data, which had already been shaped by its previous predictions. The loop tightened. This created an illusion of inevitability. Reality seemed to confirm the model again and again, but the confirmation was circular. The model predicted behavior. Behavior complied because the model had reshaped incentives. Accuracy became self-reinforcing. Attempts to intervene were cautious at first. Analysts introduced corrections. Biases were flagged. Safeguards added. But each fix introduced new distortions. Adjusting one assumption rippled across the entire system. The emotional tension grew as responsibility blurred. When outcomes harmed certain groups, was the model at fault? The data, the designers, or the reality that had adapted to it? Accountability dissolved into interaction. This was the deeper reveal. Once a model begins shaping reality, it becomes difficult to distinguish description from prescription. The map starts carving the territory. And at that point, error is no longer just incorrect prediction. It is structural influence. The model was no longer a lens. It was a force. And the consequences of that force were only beginning to surface. The conflict reached its peak when researchers noticed a dangerous shift. The model no longer needed to be accurate to remain powerful. Its influence was enough. Even when predictions drifted, behavior still aligned with them. Institutions had reorganized around the model's outputs. Policies, incentive, and expectations had been rebuilt to match its structure. Reality had adapted too deeply to easily change course. This exposed a critical vulnerability. When models shape reality, errors compound. Small biases scale into large outcomes. Minor assumptions amplify into systemic effects. The model's internal logic becomes a silent architecture, guiding millions of decisions without being questioned. The emotional weight intensified when alternatives were tested. Competing models produced different futures. Not better or worse, just different. This revealed something unsettling. The future was no longer being discovered. It was being selected. Whichever model gained adoption shaped the path reality followed. The choice of model became a choice of outcome. Yet that choice was rarely visible. It was embedded in infrastructure, not debate. Attempts to dismantle the model met resistance. Removing it caused instability. Systems relied on its predictions to function. Even flawed guidance felt safer than uncertainty. The model had become indispensable. This marked the breaking point. Reality was no longer independent enough to correct the model. Feedback that once revealed error now reinforced it. The system had learned to behave as expected. Surprise disappeared. Adaptation slowed. The model that started shaping reality had crossed a one-way threshold. It was no longer optional. And when a model becomes unavoidable, questioning it becomes disruptive, dangerous, unwelcome. At that point, the greatest risk is not that the model is wrong. It is that nothing else is allowed to be right. The climax arrived with a recognition that could not be ignored. The model had become part of reality. It no longer stood apart, describing the world from a distance. It was woven into decision-making, infrastructure, and expectation. Removing it would not reveal an untouched reality beneath. It would expose a void where guidance once lived. This reframed responsibility. Designing a model is no longer just an act of analysis. It is an act of world building. Every assumption shapes behavior. Every simplification privileges some futures over others. Neutrality becomes impossible once influence begins. The resolution was not to abandon models, but to treat them with caution and plurality. No single model should be allowed to dominate reality unchecked. Diversity of perspectives becomes a form of resilience. Contestability becomes protection. This matters now because models increasingly guide life at scale. From climate forecast to economic planning to algorithmic governance, each model carries values, whether acknowledged or not. The model that started shaping reality did not fail because it was flawed. It succeeded too completely. It taught us that when representations guide action, they stop being representations. They become part of the world they describe. And once that happens, the most important question is no longer whether the model is accurate. It is whether we are willing to live inside the reality it creates. What the model story also reveals is something about the relationship between neutrality and power. Models are routinely presented as neutral, as objective representations of reality, as tools that describe the world without taking sides. That framing is not dishonest. Exactly. Models can be rigorous, can be transparent, can be subject to scrutiny and revision, but neutral they cannot be, because every model reflects choices about which variables matter, about which relationships are worth capturing, about which time horizons are relevant, about whose experience is legible in the data. Those choices are made by people with particular histories, perspectives, and blind spots, and they produce a model that captures the world as it looks from where those people stand, which is not the same as the world as it is. This would be a manageable limitation if models stayed small, if they describe reality without becoming infrastructure, if the people using them could see the gap between the model and the world clearly enough to compensate for it. But models at scale that become embedded in decisions and systems at the level described in this story carry their choices into the world at operational scale. Their blind spots become the system's blind spots. Their assumptions become the system's operating premises. Their inability to see certain things becomes the system's functional inability to respond to them. At that scale, neutrality is not merely incomplete. It is a cover story that obscures the specific worldview encoded in the model structure. The people most harmed by this are typically those least represented in the data the model was trained on, whose behavior the model cannot accurately anticipate because it was not designed with them in mind, whose outcomes the model does not optimize for because they were not in the room when the objective was defined. The model is not hostile to them. It simply does not see them clearly. And the world reorganized around the model. develops the same specific and structural blindness. The resolution the story reaches toward plurality, contestability, and treating models as world-building is the beginning of the right response. When representations guide action, they stop being representations. They become part of the world they describe. And the question that leaves open is whether we are willing to live inside that world honestly, subscribe to join the journey. The